The next morning I sipped my coffee with a far steadier hand than the day before. The taste was sharper, more satisfying. Maybe it was the knowledge that I had every legal document needed to disassemble Karen's house of cards. Or maybe it was because I'd called in a few favors from people who still owed me from courtrooms past. Either way, I wasn't just angry anymore. I was focused. And focus in my line of work always meant trouble for the one standing on the wrong side of the law. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, my late father used to tell me. But justice? That's best served with meticulous preparation, and meticulous I would be. I had no intention of confronting her with bluster or dramatic speeches. That wasn't my style. This was going to be a dismantling, a silent deconstruction of her entire fake empire, brick by brick, form by form. First, I contacted my old friend Michael, a city records official who still owed me from a ruling I'd made years ago involving a property tax reassessment. I told him I needed every public filing from the HOA, especially the incorporation documents, financial reports, community charter, and anything involving annexations of lots into the HOA district. He didn't ask questions. A few hours later, I had a stack of digital PIFs sitting in my inbox. It didn't take long to spot the first glaring issue. My property was never formally annexed. Karen had submitted an updated map with my lot included, but there was no signature from the zoning board, no official approval stamp. Nothing. She had drawn it in by hand, then photocopied it. Sloppy, illegal, and utterly void. I double-checked it against the original subdivision plat I had signed off on over a decade ago. Lot 42, my lot, was outside the jurisdiction line. It was written clearly in the meeting minutes I still had archived on my home server. Karen hadn't just overstepped her bounds. She committed fraud by including my land in her self-made version of the HOA map. That was the kind of thing that made judges, even retired ones, lean forward in their chairs. Got you, I whispered to myself, the words hanging in the silence of my study like a promise. I called another friend, this time in the accounting field. Her name was Sophie, and she specialized in nonprofit audits. I told her about Karen, the towing records, the strange party fund expenses, and the way she funneled fines toward personal gain. Sophie had a nose for cooked books and a penchant for dragging egotistical board members through financial hell. She practically begged me to send over the HOA's expense reports, which, thanks to Michael, I already had. While Sophie dissected the numbers, I made a call to an attorney named Victor who specialized in municipal code violations and enforcement abuse. Victor had once sued a local town for seizing a man's shed because it was 3 inches too tall. He won. When I explained what Karen had done, including towing my car from private property and issuing a fine with no authority, he immediately offered to draft a civil complaint, not just against the HOA, but against Karen personally. Things were clicking into place and fast, but I still needed the final piece. I had to know if this was just about me or if she had made a pattern of targeting homeowners who challenged her. That's when the unexpected happened. An anonymous letter arrived in my mailbox, hand-delivered, no stamp, no return address. It was a single page typed in courier font. The message was simple. You're not the first. Karen's been using fines and tows as weapons for years. She patted the board with her friends and drove out the last treasurer when he found inconsistencies. She's hiding HOA funds. Look into the community improvement line in the 2022 report. Also, she paid for a new bathroom vanity. Personal, not communal. No signature, but it was enough. I reopened the 2022 HOA financial summary and went straight to the Community Improvement Fund. Almost $15,000 spent, and there were no matching records of work orders, contractor bids, or even receipts. That kind of spending without documentation wasn't just a red flag. It was the equivalent of a 5-alarm fire in audit circles. Sophie confirmed my suspicions that same afternoon. She's siphoning money through fake line items. I found payments made to companies that don't exist, shell vendors. At least 3 of them trace back to her cousin who runs the towing company. My jaw clenched. She had turned the HOA into her own personal atom. She fined people, towed their cars, used the funds to pay her cousin, and then rerouted improvement budgets into projects that never happened. And all of it was hidden behind the guise of neighborhood management. This wasn't just petty control, it was corruption. At this point, I didn't need more evidence, but I wanted a community voice, someone from inside the HOA to confirm what I'd found. I started making casual visits around the neighborhood, not to start drama, but to plant seeds. I told people I was concerned about the excessive towing, that I was looking into some of the HOA's filings, and that I'd be attending the next board meeting. I expected nervous silence. Instead, I got confession after confession. One elderly couple told me they had to pay $200 because their son parked half an inch onto the curb. A single mother explained how Karen had cited her for improper garden maintenance because her roses weren't HOA approved. Another man said he once brought up misfiled invoices and was promptly fined for aggressive speech at a board meeting. Then the real breakthrough came. A woman named Olivia, the former HOA secretary, asked to meet me quietly. We sat at a picnic table in the park under the guise of chatting about community safety. She brought a flash drive. I kept everything, she whispered. I knew one day someone would come along who could stop her. The drive contained scanned copies of Karen's email communications with the board, internal memos about retaliatory fines, and a list titled High-Risk Neighbors, which included anyone who had ever filed a complaint, questioned her authority, or missed a meeting. My name was on it. So were 8 others. I thanked Olivia, told her she'd done the right thing, and promised her name wouldn't be dragged into it. She smiled for the first time in what looked like years. As I walked home, I thought about the layers of deception Karen had built over time. It was impressive in a way, a toxic little empire hiding behind HOA bylaws and fine print. But it was also fragile, and now it was riddled with cracks. The final thing I did that day was file a formal request with the City Zoning Board to review the HOA's incorporation documents and boundary filings. I asked them to place an administrative hold on all HOA enforcement activity within the neighborhood pending review. Once filed, that request would effectively freeze Karen's ability to issue fines or carry out towing orders. It would also trigger a compliance review from the city, which meant they'd be forced to look at her operations with a legal microscope. The war had officially escalated, but she still didn't know it yet. Karen was walking through her perfectly trimmed yard, clipboard in hand, likely thinking she had won again. But she hadn't just picked a fight with another scared homeowner. She picked one with the judge who wrote the playbook, and I was just getting started. The invitation to Karen's infamous HOA Appreciation Gala arrived 2 days later in the most hilariously tone-deaf fashion possible. Hand-delivered by a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, the glossy flyer featured Karen's face front and center, smiling beside a golden ribbon and an exaggerated quote in italics that read, "Leadership is doing what's right even when others can't see the vision." I nearly spilled my morning tea reading those words. The universe, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. The event was to be held at the neighborhood clubhouse, complete with catered food, champagne, and a presentation about her so-called Community Beautification Initiative. It would have been laughable if I hadn't already seen the financial records showing that this entire gala was likely being funded by fines ripped from homeowners who had dared to question her. This wasn't a celebration. It was a cover-up. A pageant to distract the neighborhood while she shuffled paperwork and buried the evidence. What Karen didn't know was that this event would become the perfect spotlight for the truth I was about to reveal. I decided to attend, not to be petty or confrontational, but because I wanted to see the look on her face when her kingdom of nonsense started crumbling plank by plank in front of her biggest audience. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I didn't even plan to speak. The documents I was bringing would do all the talking. Sophie had finished the audit, and the results were devastating. Over $40,000 of misused HOA funds spread across personal expenses, bogus contractors, and reimbursements made to her cousin's towing company. The payments were spaced out just enough to seem inconspicuous at first glance, but traced back, they painted a picture of sustained and deliberate abuse. Victor had also finished drafting the civil complaint, naming Karen individually for fraudulent enforcement, defamation, and the unlawful seizure of private property. Mine. The evening of the gala, I arrived precisely on time. The clubhouse had been decorated with gold streamers, plastic centerpieces shaped like little gavels, and an overly long red carpet that led from the parking lot to the front door. A local cover band was tuning instruments in the corner, and a buffet table sagged under the weight of shrimp cocktails and overpriced hors d'oeuvres. It looked more like a mid-level politician's fundraising party than a community event. Karen was already making her rounds, basking in compliments that sounded more obligatory than sincere. She wore a sparkling silver blazer and carried her clipboard like it was a royal scepter. When she saw me, her smile stiffened, her grip on the clipboard tightening slightly. She approached cautiously, her voice sugary but tight. "Judge Reynolds," she said, false surprise oozing from her words, "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I hope there are no hard feelings about the towing situation. Just enforcing the rules. You know how it is." I smiled warmly. "Of course. I love a good set of rules, as long as they're legal." Her eyes flickered for half a second. I let the silence linger just long enough to make her uncomfortable before walking past her into the main room. I took a seat near the back where I could observe everything. The room filled quickly, neighbors mingling, sipping cheap champagne out of crystal-styled plastic flutes. Most looked like they'd shown up out of obligation, their expressions polite but cautious. I recognized a few faces. Olivia, the whistleblower secretary, gave me a tiny nod. The elderly couple who had told me about the curb cetacean sat 2 rows ahead, holding hands. I knew I wasn't the only one who had felt Karen's wrath, but tonight I'd be the one delivering the antidote. Karen took the stage after about 20 minutes, holding a microphone and beaming like she had just won HOA President of the Century. She launched into a speech filled with phrases like community unity, maintaining standards, and stewardship of funds. She even threw in a bizarre analogy about how the neighborhood was a garden and she was simply the humble gardener pulling out the weeds. I almost choked on my punch. Then came the slideshow. Karen proudly clicked through images of recent improvements, a newly painted bench, a security upgrade sign near the clubhouse, and photos of her at past meetings looking, as she described, dedicated and decisive. That's when the courier walked in, right on cue. He was a city clerk I knew through Victor, and he was holding a thick manila envelope in one hand and a copy of the city zoning board's administrative freeze notice in the other. He looked around, walked confidently up the aisle, and handed the documents directly to Karen mid-speech. She blinked at them, clearly thrown off her rhythm. The room murmured. She forced a smile and kept going, but her hands shook. Then she opened the envelope. You could feel the shift in the air. Karen stopped talking. Her face drained of color as she read the first few lines. She tried to laugh it off. "Oh, just a little routine zoning matter," she said into the microphone, but the wobble in her voice betrayed her. And then someone else in the audience stood up. It was Olivia. "I'd like to ask a question," Olivia said clearly. Karen tried to shut her down. "We're not doing Q at a yet, Olivia." But Olivia wasn't asking. "How much of the HOA's 2022 Community Improvement Fund went toward your bathroom remodel?" The room went silent. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Another neighbor raised a hand. "What about the towing kickbacks?" Then another. "Why are the same contractors used over and over with no bids?" The dam had broken. I didn't have to say a word. I just opened the folder I'd brought, placed copies of the audit on the community table, and stepped aside. People crowded around it like it was a crime scene, and in a way, it was. Line items were highlighted, company names cross-referenced, and notes in the margins pointed to vendor addresses that didn't exist. Karen tried to regain control, raising her voice, calling it slander, shouting that I was trying to smear her. But then the best part happened. Someone pulled out their phone and began live streaming. Within minutes, half the room was watching a Facebook live feed labeled Karen's HOA Gala Meltdown. The stream captured her yelling, the documents on the table, and the expressions of betrayal on her neighbors' faces. No amount of word salad or power posing could save her now. She was sweating through her blazer, the clipboard trembling in her hand like a leaf in a storm. I watched from my seat, silent and steady. She turned to me finally, voice cracking. "You set me up." I stood up calmly. "No, Karen, You set yourself up. I just brought the receipts." As the crowd continued to unravel the truth, Karen stepped off the stage and walked out of the clubhouse, pushing through the red carpet like it was a runway of shame. The band quietly packed up. The shrimp cocktails sat untouched. And just like that, her reign had ended, not with a bang, but with a stack of documents and a well-timed delivery. The neighborhood would never see her the same way again. And she still had no idea how much more was coming. The aftermath of the HOA gala spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. It didn't matter whether you were walking your dog, watering your lawn, or checking your mail. Someone nearby was whispering about what had happened. Karen's meltdown had made it onto social media thanks to the live-streaming neighbor, and the clip of her stammering on stage had already racked up thousands of views by the next morning. But for me, things were just getting started. That spectacle was never meant to be the finale. It was just the public tipping point. The real justice was scheduled to unfold under the fluorescent lights of a city hearing room, where Karen couldn't hide behind party decorations, and the only clipboard that mattered was the one holding sworn affidavits and zoning violations. The hearing had been fast-tracked due to the mounting evidence and community complaints that started pouring in after the event. Apparently, seeing Karen unravel on video gave people courage they hadn't felt in years. Residents submitted statements about suspicious fines, threats of home liens, and unexplained violations, with photos that didn't match the supposed infractions. Some of them even showed patterns, specific people targeted again and again for trivial reasons, especially those who had challenged Karen during past meetings. One man included security camera footage showing his trash bins getting dragged slightly out of line in the middle of the night by someone who looked suspiciously like Karen in a hoodie. "She's been playing a long game," Victor whispered to me as we reviewed the evidence, but she never expected someone to change the rules. City Hall scheduled the special hearing for Thursday afternoon, and by the time I arrived, the place was buzzing. The hearing room itself was packed. Local media outlets had caught wind of the scandal, and a few reporters with notepads and cameras waited in the hallway. Karen showed up late, wearing a blazer far less sparkly than the one she had worn to the gala, her hair tied back in a tight bun, and accompanied by her cousin, the one who ran the towing company and now posed as her legal counsel. He looked like he'd studied for the role of lawyer by watching court dramas on television. He tried to look confident, but it was clear from the way he kept flipping through pages that he had no idea what he was doing. I sat toward the front, not because I needed attention, but because I wanted to see every twitch on Karen's face as the proceedings unfolded. She avoided eye contact with me, glancing nervously at the city clerk setting up the hearing materials. A zoning officer began the session with a review of Karen's filing errors. They presented the original maps, the ones I had signed off on a decade ago, and compared them with Karen's unauthorized versions. The differences were laughable. My lot, Lot 42, was plainly excluded from HOA authority on every legal document. Karen's photocopied version looked like a child had traced it with a crayon. She claimed it had been an administrative oversight. The clerk didn't even flinch. Then came the audit findings. Sophie's detailed breakdown was entered into the record, including spreadsheet after spreadsheet showing suspicious payments, shell company transfers, and duplicated invoices. Every time a payment to her cousin's towing company was shown on screen, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Her cousin tried objecting, claiming it was defamatory, but the zoning board chair cut him off cold. "The documents were submitted under court order," she said. "If you wish to dispute them, we suggest you bring licensed counsel." That was the first moment Karen's face lost its smug veneer completely. Her cousin sank deeper into his folding chair. Then came the testimonies. One by one, residents took the stand and recounted how they had been fined for rule violations that either didn't exist or were misrepresented. A woman said she was fined for putting up a holiday wreath out of season in November. A man explained how he received a $500 citation for a satellite dish that had been on his roof since before the HOA even formed. Another neighbor described how she paid multiple fines because Karen told her she couldn't park her own car in front of her own mailbox. There were gasps, laughter, and more than one shaking head in disbelief. It wasn't just illegal, it was ridiculous. The final blow came when Olivia, the former HOA secretary, took the stand. Calm and composed, she recounted the hostile takeover Karen had engineered, removing dissenting board members, changing voting protocols without approval, and threatening anyone who questioned her with retroactive fines. Then she handed over printed emails, signed notes, and a list labeled Priority Targets, the same document she had given me weeks before. The board examined it in stunned silence. Karen looked like she might faint. The board recessed for just 20 minutes. When they returned, the decision was swift and brutal. Karen was immediately removed from her position as HOA president. The entire board was suspended pending a full city review, and a trustee panel was to be appointed temporarily to manage critical community tasks. All pending fines, fees, and enforcement actions issued under Karen's tenure were frozen. The city zoning board declared her amended HOA filings null and void and formally recorded her attempted annexation of my property as fraudulent. A report would also be sent to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges, including falsifying municipal documents and misappropriating community funds. Karen didn't say a word. Her cousin fumbled to gather his papers, but no one was listening. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously. Flashbulbs popped. I stood silently as the ruling was read. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just exhaled finally, the weight of injustice lifting from the neighborhood and settling squarely on the shoulders of the woman who had tried to make herself queen. Outside City Hall, the crowd gathered. Some cheered, others simply shook my hand, patting my shoulder with the kind of gratitude people give when you've said what they were too afraid to say themselves. One man offered to buy me a steak dinner. Another woman told me she finally felt like she could put up her garden gnome again without fear of a citation. It was surreal and humbling all at once. Karen exited through a side door, avoiding the reporters who were now focused on the city officials and residents willing to speak. She looked smaller somehow, deflated. No clipboard, no entourage, just a disgraced figure in a wrinkled blazer and scuffed shoes, vanishing into the backseat of a car like a ghost of her former tyranny. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. Her empire was over. As I walked back to my own car, resting peacefully in my legally owned driveway, untouched and unbothered, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the quiet kind you get when the tea's off, but the real kind. The kind that comes when justice lands exactly where it's supposed to. And though the war was over, I knew the final chapter was still waiting to be written, not for me, but for the community Karen left behind. They deserved closure, a celebration of sorts, and maybe just a little poetic payback. And I had one more surprise in store for them. There's something uniquely gut-wrenching about watching your car get towed away while you're holding your morning coffee, wearing nothing but a robe and one slipper. Especially when it's from your own driveway. That's exactly how my day started. Coffee splashing onto my barefoot, a tow truck rumbling in reverse, and Karen from the HOA smiling like she just won a reality show about ruining lives. I didn't even have time to process the absurdity of it before she chirped, "You can't park here, Judge Reynolds." The irony nearly made me laugh. She had no idea the man whose car she just towed was the very judge who approved the zoning for this entire neighborhood. And now I was going to make her wish she had read the footnotes. The coffee slipped from my hand and shattered on the concrete as I limped toward the driver's side of the tow truck. "Excuse me, you're towing the wrong car," I called out. The driver barely looked at me before nodding toward the woman with the clipboard standing triumphantly on the sidewalk. Karen, tan trench coat, huge sunglasses, and that same folder of HOA citations she was infamous for. I'd seen her wave it like a sword at neighborhood kids riding bikes too fast or dogs pooping too close to her roses. Today, I was apparently her next victim. She didn't even bother making eye contact. "You were warned, sir, that driveway is under LA jurisdiction, and personal vehicles can't be stored overnight unless registered." I looked around, absolutely baffled. "Karen, this is my own property. My name is literally etched in the land record. I own the land. That driveway is part of my lot. This isn't an apartment complex with communal parking. I'm a homeowner, not a tenant." She finally turned to face me, lips pursed, eyes smug. "Well, the bylaws say otherwise, and as acting HOA president, I'm enforcing them." She snapped her fingers like a coach signaling a play. The truck rolled forward with my Lexus dangling behind it like a defeated prize. I wanted to scream, but instead, I just stood there, watching it disappear down the street, the HOA fine notice now fluttering in my mailbox like a victory flag she had planted. The absurdity of it all settled over me like fog. I walked back into my house, tripping coffee in disbelief. My hands shook as I peeled the fine notice open. Unauthorized vehicle in driveway, $150. Towing fee, $75. Storage per day, $25. HOA citation fee, triple slap in the face. I sat down at my desk, stared at the mess she'd created, and chuckled to myself. She didn't know. She had no clue, not just about who I was, but what power I had. You see, I'm Judge Thomas Reynolds. I spent 23 years presiding over zoning disputes, land use battles, and municipal ordinances. I've seen towns rise and fall on technicalities buried in subparagraphs. I was the one who approved this entire subdivision, Lot 42 included, which happens to be mine, and my property was explicitly written into the zoning charter as exempt from HOA oversight. The clause existed because, when the land was developed, my lot was still outside the scope of their jurisdiction. That driveway she claimed authority over. It wasn't even supposed to be under HOA control. The woman just committed a legal faceplant in front of a man who built the staircase. But I didn't get angry. I got precise. There's something about the slow burn of legal revenge that's far more satisfying than shouting. I opened my storage drawer, pulled out the original community development plat I had archived years ago, and laid it on the table. Clear as day, the boundary lines showed my lot segmented off. HOA boundaries started one property over. It was like watching a chessboard where your opponent had just moved her queen into checkmate without realizing it. Still, I needed more. I wanted to know why this happened. Was this just Karen being a control freak, or was something deeper going on? I called the towing company. A bored voice answered, "Yes, that vehicle was towed under HOA instruction. Same as always. Karen uses us almost every week. We got an account set up with her. That was strange. Most HOAs only towed cars after multiple violations. Karen seemed to be calling towels like she was ordering takeout. I asked for a record of tow jobs initiated by the HOA in the last 6 months. The list they emailed me was outrageous. Over 50 tows, and the reasons were vague at best. Improper alignment, unsightly vehicle, non-compliant decal. She was using towing as punishment, as intimidation, and she was profiting from it. I called a friend who works as an internal auditor. "Run this for me," I said, forwarding the logs. "Tell me if there's a pattern." 10 minutes later, he replied, "Most of these vehicles belong to residents who filed complaints against the HOA. Classic retaliation. This isn't petty anymore. It's systemic." I walked outside and looked at the now empty space in my driveway. The ridiculousness of it all almost made me laugh again. Karen had weaponized her clipboard. She had turned a community organization into a dictatorship. And today, she picked the wrong garage to poke. I wasn't just going to get my car back. I was going to take apart her little regime, brick by brick. Later that afternoon, I sat in the back row of the HOA clubhouse where Karen was holding her usual Wednesday compliance meeting. A few neighbors were there, mostly quiet, heads down. Karen stood at the front like she was teaching a class nobody wanted to attend. I listened as she berated a couple for putting up Halloween decorations in September and threatened to fine another resident for leaving his trash can out 30 minutes too long. When she finally noticed me, her face froze. She blinked. "Judge Reynolds," she said cautiously, "did you need something?" I stood and walked forward slowly, deliberately. "Actually, yes. I've got a few questions about jurisdiction, liability, and the misuse of enforcement power. Do you have a moment?" The room went silent. Karen's fingers tightened around her clipboard. I could see the gears in her head starting to panic. "Is this about the towing situation?" she asked, suddenly defensive, because I was only following bylaws. I stopped her with a smile. "Bylaws you don't have the legal authority to enforce on my property. I'd like to formally request an audit of your activities and expenditures for the last fiscal year, and I'll be bringing this to the city zoning board. You might want to make sure your documents are in order." Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. A neighbor in the back snorted. Another smirked. The cracks were beginning to show. The clipboard trembled in her hand, and I hadn't even started yet. I walked out of the clubhouse without another word. The war had begun, but it wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be precise. Paperwork was my weapon, and Karen had no idea how much firepower I had stacked and ready. A week after the hearing, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. The air was lighter. People were smiling again, not nervously, but genuinely. Lawns were being mowed without fear of a random citation for noise ordinance disruption. Kids were riding their bikes without being chased down for not wearing HOA-approved neon vests. Even the old couple down the block had dragged their rocking chairs back onto the porch for the first time in months. It was like someone had lifted a suffocating lid off the community, and everyone was finally allowed to breathe again. But I wasn't done yet. Justice had been served, yes, but justice is only half as satisfying without the punctuation of poetic closure. I had one last move to make, something that would leave a lasting impression on both the neighborhood and Karen herself, wherever she was licking her wounds. The newly appointed interim board had contacted me, asking if I'd consider helping review the HOA's outdated bylaws. I declined politely. I didn't want a seat at the table. I didn't want power. I just wanted peace and a clean driveway. But I did suggest they make one small adjustment to the annual community event calendar. I proposed a new tradition, one inspired by the events we had all just survived together. I called it Neighbor Justice Day. It would be held on the anniversary of the infamous gala, and the highlight of the event would be a satirical mock trial where residents could nominate humorous fake charges for things like loudest leaf blower or most overly decorated mailbox, and the community would vote on silly punishments like having to mow someone else's lawn while wearing a flamingo costume. It was meant to heal, to laugh, to remember how close we all came to losing our community spirit to unchecked authority. The new board loved the idea. The neighborhood loved it even more. The first Neighbor Justice Day was held in the park next to the clubhouse. It was potluck style, with kids playing lawn games, dogs roaming freely, and no clipboard in sight. I had stayed out of the planning, but the new board surprised me with something that nearly knocked me over when I arrived. They had built a makeshift courtroom stage, complete with cardboard gavels, paper scales of justice, and a podium labeled the People's Bench. But the centerpiece, crafted lovingly by a few of the more mischievous neighbors, was a wooden cutout of a giant clipboard, spray-painted gold, and mounted to a stand like a ceremonial trophy. Above it, in bold black lettering, a plaque read, "Here lies the reign of Karen. May we never be ruled by fear again." The laughter it generated echoed across the park. People took pictures with it. Kids used it as a target for beanbags. Someone added a plastic crown to the top, just to complete the effect. I watched it all unfold from a picnic bench, smiling to myself, not as the man who had ended the madness, but as a neighbor. Just another guy with a lawn, a mailbox, and a dog that liked to bark a little too much after dark. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was plain, no return address, and it had been dropped into my mailbox by hand. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short handwritten note. "I hope you're satisfied. You humiliated me in front of everyone. I built that HOA from the ground up. I kept things in order. Now it's chaos. You'll see how fast it falls apart without structure. I was just trying to make this neighborhood better. Enjoy your circus." It wasn't signed, but I knew it was Karen. The handwriting was tight and controlled, just like everything she did. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in my file cabinet under a tab I'd labeled Interesting. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Weeks passed, and the board formally released a report to all residents, confirming that Karen's financial activities had triggered a criminal investigation. She hadn't been arrested yet, but charges were pending. Her cousin had quietly dissolved the towing company. The city council even voted to implement new oversight procedures for HOA organizations, inspired in part by our case. Karen's mess had led to something good. wider accountability, and smarter regulations to prevent another HOA dictatorship from taking root. I decided it was time to make my peace with the land she tried to control. One Sunday morning, I went to the edge of my driveway where the infamous tow had taken place. I placed a new sign there, carved into reclaimed wood. Simple, but bold. It read, "Private property, Lot 42, established with integrity." I didn't do it to be smug. I did it to remind myself of how far we'd come, and to remind Karen, if she ever passed by again, that some lines cannot be redrawn, no matter how hard you press the pen. Later that day, a few neighbors came by to thank me. One brought a tray of cookies. Another handed me a handwritten card signed by 20 other residents. One note inside read, "You didn't just save your driveway. You gave us back our homes." I wasn't the kind of man who chased gratitude, but that one hit me in the chest. I kept the card on my mantle. Every time I glanced at it, I felt a quiet kind of pride. Not courtroom pride. Not the bang the gavel type. Just the peaceful feeling of knowing that standing up at the right time, for the right reason, had actually made a difference. On the anniversary of the first gala, the community gathered again. This time, instead of a smug speech and glittering champagne, the park filled with laughter, music, and freedom. I was asked to say a few words. I kept it short. I told them that power in a neighborhood doesn't come from rules. It comes from respect. That titles mean nothing if you forget the people behind the front doors. And that the moment someone uses a clipboard like a weapon, it's time to grab a flashlight and see what they're really hiding behind the curtain. The crowd applauded, but the best part wasn't the applause. It was watching the way everyone mingled afterward, not as residents bound by fear, but as neighbors finally free. Kids splashed in sprinklers. Dogs darted between legs. Lawn chairs lined the sidewalks. No more summons. No more citations. Just community. I never saw Karen again. She moved out quietly in the middle of the night, according to one neighbor. Her house listed on the market with an agent who politely referred to it as a fixer-upper with a history. She left behind her crown, her clipboard, and her illusion of control. In the end, she wasn't defeated by anger or confrontation. She was undone by facts, patience, and a neighborhood that remembered how to stand together. As for me, I still sit on my porch most evenings, coffee in hand, slippers on, watching the sun set over my perfectly ordinary driveway. No cars being towed. No fear of fines. Just peace. And sometimes, when the breeze is just right, I swear I can hear the ghost of that tow truck's engine fading off in the distance, taking the last traces of her rule with it.